I call Materia Ture.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker, tēnā koutou katoa te whare. This bill has two very simple purposes. The first is to help with Nick Smith's ridiculous bungling over his attempt to sell public land to private interests, land that should be offered back to Māori first, and so the bill does try to find some way of fixing that big mistake. The second, more importantly, I think, is that it is designed to make two government ministers, in effect, the sole owners of an $18 billion asset that's been built by generations of New Zealanders for the many generations to follow. And under this bill, sir, these two ministers can sell off any amount of that asset that they choose to anyone that they like for any price that they decide is okay, with zero oversight from the rest of New Zealand. The second and the primary purpose of the bill, sir, the selling off of an $18 billion state asset, makes it the largest state asset sale that this country has ever seen. And not only is this bill designed to facilitate the sale of this multi-billion dollar asset, it's sale to anyone from anywhere. So there are no constraints on these two ministers as to how they choose to flog it off. It is a massive transfer of New Zealand's housing wealth, potentially sold off for a song to Australia, to the UK, to America, to Canada, whoever the two property-owning ministers decide is in their best interest to sell it to. And there's no mandate for this. There is no mandate for this asset sale. In the latest poll, as we've heard, New Zealanders are overwhelmingly opposed to the sale of state housing to an Australian entity. They want this state housing kept in New Zealand hands. But this government wants to be able to sell it off to anybody they like. The problem for the ministers is that John Key, at the beginning of this year, very grandly announced that he was going to sell 2,000 state houses in 2015 and 8,000 state houses before the election in 2017. But he failed to tell this to the agencies that he then expected to just front up with the cash to buy them. They, like the Salvation Army, did the economic analysis after being sprung on by this announcement and found actually that the cost of the housing which has been neglected and degraded because of years of deferred and poor maintenance, made the whole concept of this thousands of houses being sold, the whole concept was ludicrous. The cost of buying the homes and then restoring them to any degree of safe use for the tenants was simply beyond New Zealand's community organisations, no matter how motivated they are by compassion for the tenants in these homes. And now, with this grandiose announcement by John Key about selling all these thousands of houses in total tatters, because there's nobody to buy them, the government is now legislating to let two ministers, just two, treat New Zealand state housing as if they are their own personal property, to override the Housing New Zealand Board and to sell off these homes to whoever they want for whatever price. Now, we may well hear the Minister and others from National claim that they are bound by the social housing reform objectives, but I can assure the country that those objectives do not provide any protection for the retention or increase of more state housing in this country. The ministers only have to consider one of those objectives, not all of them. And if the Housing New Zealand Board, which is supposed to be responsible for this work, if the Housing New Zealand Board strongly disagrees with the minister's plan to sell off the housing, they have absolutely no authority to stop the ministers acting as if they are the personal landlords of state houses. This bill makes two ministers the landlord for 60,000 families. 60,000 families will now have what? Paula Bennett, Bill English as their personal landlords, a landlord who will not fix the leaks, who will not improve the ventilation, who will not fix the dampness in those homes, who will not fix the broken windows or replace the missing doors or deal with the poor heating in those homes. Landlords who are hell-bent on selling the properties and kicking out the tenants. And this is at a time when, in last week's household income survey, it showed that 45,000 more children are living in poverty than were in 2013, for the most part because their parents' incomes have stagnated and their housing costs for those families have skyrocketed. 75% of families getting the accommodation supplement are paying more than 40% of their income in housing costs. That is a massive burden on low-income families. 50% of these people are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. They simply cannot afford to be in the private market, and they certainly can't afford to buy their own homes. They are locked out of decent housing and they are locked out of home ownership. But this government has this pathological aversion to increasing the state housing stock to help to curb the massive rent increases and the massive price increases that we see fueling the housing crisis. On top of that, we know 75% of the children in poverty whose parents rely on a benefit show that this government is deliberately keeping those families in poverty. 75% of the poorest kids live in families dependent on a benefit, and benefits are so low that these families have no escape. And don't listen to any of the rhetoric around the $25 increase. We know most families won't even see $20 of that if they're lucky. 7 out of 10 children living in poverty live in rental housing. 7 out of 10 who live in poverty live in rentals. Rental housing is predominantly cold, damp and unsafe. Rental housing contributes, poor quality housing contributes to 1,600 deaths each winter in New Zealand. And rental housing is in many cases the responsibility for that, and in some very clear cases, state rental housing is responsible for that. We all remember Emma-Lita, don't we? We all remember Emma-Lita. So the question is, will the two ministers take their new landlord responsibility seriously? Will they make sure that all of the homes that they are responsible for are warm and dry and safe for the children who live in them? Will they fix the broken windows, install the insulation, put in the safe heating devices? And the answer is, of course they won't. Of course they're not going to go anywhere near that, because their only objective under this bill is to be the auctioneer. They want to sell the properties. They don't want to invest any more in the maintenance. There's no value in them doing that. It hasn't been up till now, and there isn't any impetus now under this legislation for them to fix those homes. The only objective under this bill is the asset stripping of New Zealanders of this $18 billion asset. So in the process of throwing out thousands of New Zealand families who we know from the report on household income survey are stuck in a poverty trap, government is making that situation for those families so much worse by inaction and neglect, and by an ideology that says that the state shouldn't be involved in housing, no matter how desperately New Zealand families need the state to provide that very basic safety net. So, sir, it will come as no surprise to you, or I expect the government, that we are opposing this bill. We are deeply disappointed that in the face of all of the evidence that shows the desperate need for improved quality of this housing, the desperate need for more of it for the families who are living in garages in their cars, as we know they are now, and disappointed in the failure of government to take seriously the 1,600 deaths, which include many hundreds of children, that happen every winter because of poor quality housing, that the only solution that this government presents, the only solution, is to flog off one of the last remaining safety nets that our families and their kids so desperately need. The last remaining safety net, sir, that our grandparents built in order to protect our grandchildren and their children too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.